Hello, I'm Prue Gordon, the Executive Director of the Australian Centre for International Trade and Investment. Welcome to this impromptu webinar that we are bringing to you about MC13 and particularly the services and digital outcomes from MC13. We are so fortunate to have with us Jane Drake-Brockman, who is a legend on the Australian trade policy scene. Jane has multiple decades of experience working on a range of trade issues, but with a very, very deep knowledge and experience of working in the services and digital space. She's currently the principal consultant with JDB Consultants, or sorry, I should say JDB Solutions. Sorry, Jane. You're an industry professor with the Institute for International Trade at the University of Adelaide. Part of the reason why we're talking to you today is because you're co-convener of the Asia Pacific Services Coalition, as well as being a director. And I understand you were the founder of the Australian Services Roundtable. You're also you've had so many years. I won't go through your very long work history because I'm really keen to cut to the chase. You're currently in London, but as we both know, the Ministerial Council, the World Trade Organization Ministerial Conference, I should say, the 13th Ministerial Conference is underway in Abu Dhabi. And so we hope we talk to you at the conclusion of that negotiation or of that meeting, but it's continuing. So, which is not unusual for ministerial conferences, but can you start off by letting us know why there's been an extension to these meetings?
Well, Prue, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Perfectly.
Well, look, I was hoping that as we spoke tonight, there'd be some breaking news, but it was about an hour and a half ago, about 9 o'clock Abu Dhabi time, the ministerial conference was officially extended through Friday morning, probably shouldn't end any later than 2 p.m. and some ministers will have already left. USTR, she has said she won't change her flight. It's possible the Indian minister might also have left. But why this happened and what it means is what I'd like to quickly explain. It was clear by about 2 hours ago that they were at the kind of peak of the crisis, if you like, and there were very few obvious clear directions forward. So they were already definitely going to have to work all night, but I guess the realization came that, you know, there's no text ready to be put in front of ministers yet on any issue, because every issue is being held hostage one way or another against other issues, but in particular, the Australian Services Roundtable's issues on services and digital trade, believe it or not, which is rarely the case, but it's come down to our issues seemingly versus everybody else's in the political trade-offs that are going on. So negotiators are really tired. They'll be up all night tonight. The heads of delegation, that's the official level, will meet about 11 a.m. their time. Ministers will have quick sign-off in that sort of 12 to 2 o'clock time. Now, when you're at the peak of a crisis, things might suddenly settle down quickly because you're under that last-minute time pressure, but it's very unusual to have every issue outstanding, and that means it is really hard because the political trade-offs are not going to be obvious, and for the issues I care about, they're going to have to, I believe, end up being within the services and digital trade agenda, because no one's going to be prepared to trade off the other big issues. So when I say there's no agreement on anything, I mean there is not yet a deal on agriculture. There is not yet a deal on investment. There is not yet a deal on development. There is not yet a deal on dispute settlement. There is not yet a deal on the moratorium or on the e-commerce work program.
Mm.
So that's an awful lot of issues to work through, and the outcomes still very much hang in the balance. So what ASR is focused on, and the entire Asia Pacific Services Coalition is focused on, and the Global Services Coalition is focused on, and I would say there are more services businesses in Abu Dhabi than ever before for any other ministerial. And in the Global Coalition, we've divided the jobs up, and I have to be in London watching the global media, because you can't do everything when you're in the margins of a ministerial meeting. It's actually been very hard for the NGO stakeholders there. It's been very difficult to talk to the press there. So it's turned out well for us that from London I can watch the New Straits Times and the Jakarta Post, as well as watching all the European and US press. So the two issues that we care about, one is on the ministerial agenda and the other one, frankly, is not. The first issue's been on every ministerial agenda for a quarter of a century, every single meeting, and the other one is still for the future. But if things go wrong at this ministerial, then our objectives for the other one could be very seriously derailed. So the first issue is the WTO moratorium on customs duties on electronic transmissions.
Mm-hmm.
And the second is the plurilateral negotiations known as the WTO Joint Initiative on Electronic Commerce. And understanding either of them takes a bit of history. Shall I perhaps?
That would be great for those of our listeners who don't know much about either of those. If you give us a bit of background, that would be fantastic.
Well, just a little bit, but if we go back to 1998, which is probably about when trade negotiators first discovered email, perhaps first made their first purchases online, probably for a hard copy book, probably. In that year, the WTO established a work program on e-commerce. 25 years later, that work program has delivered a big zero. But luckily, at the time the work program was initiated, there was an awareness that what this was ultimately about was electronically delivered services. And they agreed on one intermediate and provisional piece of trade governance, which, along with the GATS, which covers all modes of services delivery.
Yep, the General Agreement on Trade and Services.
Yes. And that this piece of trade governance, known as the moratorium, has enabled the digital transformation to go ahead and take place. Now, but what it is, it's a ban on tariffs on international electronic transmissions. Now, anyone who has logged onto a website or scanned a QR code has sent and received a series, multiple electronic transmissions, many of them international, to the point where every click you make takes you probably multiple times across an international border. That's what we're talking about. If this issue is rather like no other that's ever been on the WTO agenda, it actually matters to each and every single one of us. Imagine every single click paying a customs duty, and governments having to work out how many thousands of borders that click just crossed. I mean, the internet is about connecting us all. It's been the most inclusive developmental boost the global economy's ever had, the most inclusive.
Mm.
But every ministerial, it gets harder and harder to achieve ready and obvious renewal, and this year's been extremely hard. I don't know why some governments don't get it, but they don't. Some governments want to build their own digital industries, and they think a protectionist approach is the way to go, despite the global literature showing that you don't need a protectionist approach to build your own industry. But these days we talk less about e-commerce, I suppose, and more about, we use the term digital trade. And that brings me to the next thing. Frustration with this long 25 years of work program meant that a plurilateral initiative was taken to start negotiations on e-commerce without the multilateral mandate to do it, but they would do it anyway. It was not the first of the plurilateral initiatives. We might come to the first a bit later, but this agreement has now been, this agreement to negotiate has now been going for 5 years and is very, very close to ready. Now, that plurilateral deal, which has about 125 participants in it, includes a moratorium, but not just a moratorium, a permanent ongoing ban, just like 100 free trade agreements and digital economy agreements out there all also do. And they define it very clearly. There is a kind of an argument, it's a nonsensical one, about what are we talking about, the e-transmission itself or the content of what's transmitted, the bits and the bytes or the data? I mean, is there really any difference between those two things? Could we separate them? All 100 of those FTAs that have a permanent ban on customs duties on e-transmissions defines it to cover both the transmission and the content, because anything else doesn't make sense. However, this year, we are being told, as we were told 2 years ago, that there has to be more agreement on what is an e-transmission. So it's a kind of a disingenuous argument, really, but it's what's holding things up. So if the multilateral moratorium fails tomorrow, today your time, by 6 o'clock your time today, you should know. If it fails, then those plurilateral negotiations have a big rug pulled out from under them, because a permanent moratorium is part of that negotiation. And so there are many things that might happen depending on what happens on the moratorium. That's why I'm watching it so closely. That's why the global services community is watching it very closely. 2 years ago, we had 100 business signatories to our letter to governments on this subject. This year, we've got 228.
You can see the attraction imposing duties would have for governments who are seeking additional revenue, but at the same time, I understand massive issues with how you'd even implement it and make it effective. Are there any particular countries standing out who would like to see or who are wanting the moratorium to end?
Oh, there are only 3. I mean, India, South Africa, and Indonesia. And I mean, Bangladesh and Pakistan are kind of going along with India. The revenue raising argument has been completely debunked by the IMF quite clearly. There is no, if you want to raise revenue, you're better off with a VAT and a sales tax. India already has one. Indonesia already has one. They're very lucrative. Indonesia is the only country which has already put into its customs classification a code with a 0 tariff on it, but ready to go the minute it's allowed. India wants to, it seems to think it can put it on some transmissions and not on others. The problem is the internet is a network. It's almost impossible to put a customs duty on one transmission without it impacting on multiple other transmissions. But it's those three, and ultimately it's India.
Okay.
And it is India holding up every single one of those other issues that I have explained, all hang in the balance. In every single case, it's India. And India is no longer allied with the bulk of developing country voices. It's no longer a global south. It's just India. So it's a very unusual situation. Very unusual and very difficult.
So, I mean, India has a fairly long history of, I mean, playing the spoiler role is probably a strong word, but in WTO negotiations and GATT negotiations before, they've often played the spoiler role. But at the same time, when you're looking at what they're trying to do with free trade agreements, you sort of had hoped maybe they would come around a bit more and try and be more, I guess, constructive in some of these negotiations. But I know there are a lot of
they're a global tech giant, Prue. You know, they have everything to lose if the moratorium is lost. And I mean, their positions on agriculture or investment or any of those things are long-standing ones, but they and they're in the middle of election campaigning right now in India. So it's the Indian minister needs something to take home. So every single issue is hanging there to make sure he gets one that he can take home.
So in terms of the alternative, the moratorium to either end or to continue, but in what form? Are they talking about what kind of form the moratorium might continue in? Like just another 2-year extension, or talking about making it permanent?
I know the multilateral discussion is only about extending it, subject to whatever hostage taking happens, or ending it. Ending it. Well, that if it ends, Prue, that's the death sentence. That's the last WTO meeting, because its mission and function is to keep markets open. There have never been tariffs on digital services. And if we suddenly have a WTO decision to allow new trade restrictions, it's the opposite of what the WTO is there to do. So if we lose it this time, that's the end for business interest in the WTO. It will mean that the WTO is simply unable to do the work required to make it relevant for the digital economy. So I don't have.
So then the plurilaterals, I guess, would increase in prominence, and more countries you'd imagine would focus their energy there.
My concern is that the opposite might happen, that one will derail the other, because the plurilateral one is being very quiet to give the multilateral thing its best possible chance. But if it is lost, then one might lose Indonesia as a participant in the plurilateral process, for example. That would be an unhappy outcome. It might mean that JSI participants start questioning the definition and scope in the plurilateral one. I need to say something about that, because you asked me what is the text likely to look like. Look, the best we could possibly hope for at this stage tonight is that I'm an optimist, Prue, you know that. And for 24 hours more, I'm prepared to say I'm a multilateralist. So my optimistic projection forward is we will get an extension of the moratorium, which links that extension, doesn't link it, just also says that the e-commerce work program can spend another 2 years looking at definition and scope. So we waste another 2 years doing what we did for the last 2 years. The problem is that the plurilateral moratorium has a clear definition and scope. It covers content. And what we don't want is that whole scope and definition ridiculous argument. It's like a big Pandora's box. So there are dangers, but if we get a moratorium extension and okay, we go away and we keep thinking about scope and definition, then I would say, all right, it's not instant death. That would be the best I would be prepared to declare until I'd read the text in detail, but it would not be instant death. We live to fight another day, but there are risks for the plurilateral.
So how about services? Because I know the JSI in services did have some successes. I understood some of the provisions were entered into force, but I was trying to figure out, well, how did they enter them into force considering it's a plurilateral? Can you give us a bit of a readout on what's happening on the services side of the agenda?
Yes, well, I mean, I've a couple of things I'd like to say. Okay, so the WTO reference paper on principles for services domestic regulation is the name of the outcome of those plurilateral negotiations. It was the first of the plurilaterals, the first joint statement initiative. It was extremely important, therefore, that the first one succeeded and pulled through to a grand final conclusion. It, however, has, well, first of all, that it's a plurilateral, but it's being implemented on a multilateral basis in the sense that it's most favoured nation. Countries have to take a little bit of time to write those principles, best practice principles for services regulation into their GATT schedules. When enough countries have written them into their schedules and the schedules have been reviewed and accepted, then the process is that it can enter into force. So it's old news, Prue. This deal was done at the last ministerial meeting. But, you know, if you've got no good news to tell anyone, Prue, and you've got the entire services business community there in Abu Dhabi with you, well, you'll make a big deal of it coming into force because it is a really big deal. It is the only thing that the WTO has ever done on services. And it's hugely important, and it's worth $150 billion in reduced services trade costs, and it makes a big difference to the Australian services competitiveness once it's all implemented. So it is really important, but it's old news. So how is it being, how with a multilateral? I don't want to say too much about this, but Prue, not everyone, India is trying to stand in the way. So is South Africa trying to stand in the way. I think, look, its simplest thing I can say is that there is a multilateral mandate called the GATS. Any WTO member can unilaterally change its GATT schedule in a more liberal direction if it chooses to. We take unilateral liberalising steps all the time, but we rarely go to Geneva and write them into our schedule because we keep them all as bargaining chips for when we all agree to do it together. That we could any day liberalise our schedules and bind it in law. That's what's happening. It's a multilateral mandate. Anyone can do it. So countries, some countries have wanted to negotiate with India on this. The Australian government is confident that it has a mandate to do it. And ASR is completely of that view too. That's why that JSI made it through. it's really almost impossible, watertight, to argue that, especially when it's being implemented on an MFN basis. So India is being difficult and will go on being difficult, but the fact is they have no leg to stand on.
It's such a terrible time for the WTO. It has been for the last couple of years. There's been so much discussion about the end of the rules-based system, principally because of national security concerns and the shift back to industry policy as opposed to competition policy and opening of markets. I mean, obviously climate change too is having an impact on how governments are trying to achieve different policy outcomes and moving away from open markets in order to do that. In climate change, there's a lot of reason for government intervention in trying to achieve some of those outcomes. But in terms of the WTO's role, it is a depressing time for people that have a great belief in the value and the importance of the multilateral system. So thank you so much for telling us or bringing us up to speed. We're going to watch obviously closely over the next 24 hours. And I seriously hope, because I know you are an optimist, Jane, and a great believer in the system. So if you lose faith, yes, bodes very bad.
It is a real, the next few hours are going to be very, very difficult, Prue, because, you know, this is a kind of last chance for WTO members to show that they have the political will to cooperate. And as you rightly point out, we're seeing plenty of evidence that they are not in multiple other fora and in other parts of the global conversation. But if the WTO cannot pull together to do anything constructive, and in my view, in particular about the future, I mean, Alan Beattie really put this nicely in his a piece in the Financial Times earlier this week. He said the idea of holding a 21st century industry hostage to a 19th century one, or a whole series of 19th century ones, is a bit bizarre. You know, today, Prue, cross-border trade is measured in trillions of gigabytes and not in tons of anything. So if the WTO can't put down some marker that it understands that, business will lose interest. They won't go to another ministerial. This is the last one, unless this goes well tonight.
Well, on that note, let's keep watching this space. We'd love to have you back to talk about where we end up, and hopefully it's a positive result. But Jane, thank you so much. I know it's late in London. I really appreciate you making the time, but I look forward to talking to you again after we
It's all right. I'm up all night tonight. I'll be watching it. And yeah, it's a very, very tense scenario right now. I really, you know, just wish our negotiators, our Australian negotiators, all the best of luck. They've got everything there, all of it hanging in the balance, the whole lot.
On that note, thank you so much, Jane. Talk to you soon.
Thank you. Thanks, Prue.